afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Season 2 of The Clever Angle, the podcast where you get an inside look at different careers from active professionals in that field. Today, I'm joined by George Jared, a true crime author and journalist. How are you doing today, George?
I'm well, Tevin. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me, especially on such short notice.
Hey, no problem at all.
So before we get started, can you just give like a quick elevator pitch on who you are, what you do, and yeah.
Sure. My name is George Jared. I've written 3 true crime books. I'm a longtime investigative journalist. I went to college to be an attorney. That was kind of my whole thing. When I got out of high school, I wanted to be a lawyer. And my senior year of college, I was getting geared up to go to law school. And I started meeting a lot of A, miserable attorneys, and B, a lot of poor attorneys. And so I told my wife, Tracy, I said, I could handle maybe being miserable or being poor, either one at a job, but I can't handle both. And I heard a lot of that. So I decided to take a pause. I was always fascinated by journalism. I never took any journalism classes in college. And it wasn't because I didn't love the craft. It was just that I was taking classes to get myself ready for law school. So it was off my radar. And so I decided, okay, I'll take some time off. I'll get a job and I'll save some money. And then a year from now, everything will be fine. So what I did is I opened up a newspaper. First job that was listed was a reporter at a local newspaper. And I thought, okay. So I contacted the editor and he said, come down, I'll talk. Let's talk. And I said, okay. So I go in there and I was sitting, at a desk like we're sitting right now. And he looked at me and he said, so you didn't take any classes for journalism in college? I said, no, sorry, I didn't. I said, I did write a column for a local newspaper when I was in high school and I was the editor of our school newspaper. So I was familiar with some of that stuff. And he said, okay, let's do a writing test. I did a writing test. He came back and immediately sat down. He goes, you can write. He says, we'll need to clean up some of, there's a certain style that journalists write with. It's called AP style, but it's not the English AP style. It's Associated Press style. And so I had to learn that, which didn't take me very long. And so I just started writing and I really enjoyed it because, everybody has a job, they're banker, insurance, working, manufacturing, working whatever field. My wife's a teacher. And so a lot of people's days are a lot the same. I got this job and every day it was something different. Like one day I'd come to work and there was a bank robbery, like breaking news, there's a bank robbery and I got to go down there and deal with this bank robbery. The next day I would be at a school doing a feature story on like second graders in school. Like they would do like some kind of special project. Like I remember some kids were taking their books and putting them underneath their desk. And the teacher had a theory that if they laid under their desk and read books like that, their test scores would go up. She was right. I did a story about that. It's just an innovative, interesting way for somebody to teach. And so I started writing things, soybeans, who knew? And you would think that's just the most boring thing in the world. But if you ever dig into like the history of how soybeans started in like a state like Arkansas, for an afternoon, it's interesting if you just sat there and just wrote about that and then you know about it. So I had all these really unique and different, interesting experiences. Like I remember one of the first people I got to interview was Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas. Yeah. And so I got to interview him. And so I was having all these really neat, cool experiences. Well, I also noticed something else was happening too. I would go and talk to my friends who all had, again, a job like everybody has a job. And I noticed that like they'd tell me stories about their day and I was like, wow, this is really boring, but me, everything was different, was a different story every time. Well, then I covered the first murder case, I was about 7 months in and it was Rebecca Gould.
How old were you at this time?
Probably 23, 24, somewhere around that area. Yeah.
Okay, so you're 23, 24, and you said you're covering your first murder case?
Yes.
All right, keep going.
And so how it happened was I was sitting at my desk. It was, I believe it was a Wednesday morning, and I get a phone call about 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. I answer it. I'm like, hello. And a woman who was Rebecca Gould, the murder victim's aunt, says, my niece is missing, and nobody is covering this in the media at all. And I said, okay, where are you at? And she said, we're in Izard County. We're at the Izard County Sheriff's Department. I said, okay. So I go down to the Izard County Sheriff's Department. I meet the aunt, the mom. She had a bunch of sisters. And then she also met Dr. Larry Gould, who was her father. And so they hand me that missing poster that's sitting right over there on that shelf. And even actually, if you look on the back of it, the notes that I took the day of are still there. And so I start searching for this girl with this family for the next 4 or 5 days. I called my editor, and he said, just whatever. He said, write 2 or 3 stories, talk about the search, talk to people who are searching. Why are they out there? Why are they volunteering? Stuff like that. Obviously, I went and blew and I love the sheriff. I hate when I tell this part of the story because I really liked him personally, and I got along with him very well. And he's passed away now, but I blew him up because he didn't let anybody know for a couple of days that this girl was missing, and that was just an egregious error on his part. And I think he would admit to that if he could talk about it today. But I blew him up. There was by the time him and I started really going at it, there was a couple TV cameras that showed up from some TV stations, like from Springfield, Missouri and Little Rock, one from Memphis. So the story was starting to get out, and I was mad, because I was like, hey man, I'm right here, close, and you could have called, and we could have been looking for a car. We knew this girl had been injured. What happened was she vanished from the home of a friend. And when they went there to find her, there was bloody sheets in the washing machine. Her dog was there, unharmed, by the way. Her keys were there. Her car was there. It was the bloody mattress that she had fallen on or been on had been flipped. There were bloody pillows underneath the bed. So they knew pretty quickly that if she didn't show up at a hospital, they knew that she was gone. I mean, that's just the way that goes. So I spent it was exactly a week with her family. And then on Monday, September 27, 2004, they found her body down an embankment about 5 miles outside of Melbourne, Arkansas, where this all happened in Izard County. And I was out there, the search party found her body. I went out there. I saw her. It was awful. I'd never seen something like that before. I've been to funerals, like anybody has. But I'd never seen something like that. And it really affected me. Like I recoiled, like I had to get out of there. I jumped in my truck, drove back to the sheriff's department. The only thing of it was I thought that was the worst part. That would be the worst part of that day, but I was wrong. The worst part of that day was her dad came up to me and said, "Did they find my daughter?" And I didn't know what to say. So I'm like, "Larry, you need to talk to the sheriff." And then he grabbed a hold of me and said, "Did they find my daughter?" And I said, "Yes, they did." And
so what was that like? You said you spent a week with the family. What was it like during that week?
It was, I remember it was warm. It was the end of September. They were crying. They would sometimes they would be like real positive, real happy. Like their energy level would be up, the sisters and the mom and the dad. But then, sometimes like we would go out and search for a while. Like we'd go look down some gravel roads. We'd go, in fact, my wife even went out with me one day to search. And then you get back to the sheriff's department and you'd see one of the daughters on the ground curled up in a ball because they knew the inevitable was coming. And it almost got to a point where even Dr. Gould was like, I at least hope we find her, because that's you're very familiar with that part of Arkansas. It's very remote. Lots of, places that you could stash a body and maybe no one would ever find it. But she was found on the side of the road. I mean, anybody could have found her. I mean, it's shocking that she wasn't found sooner, to be honest with you. And so I always tell people, the night that she was found, I sat in the office till about 3 o'clock in the morning writing that story. And I put in all the personal anecdotes from dealing with the family all week long, every little thing about her that I had learned. And I tell people, I never met Rebecca Gould. She worked at the local Sonic there in Melbourne for a while, and her boyfriend, Casey McCullough, who she died in his house, and now his cousin was recently arrested for her murder after nearly 17 years. I ate there a few times. I would stop in if I was in Melbourne. And so it's possible I met her maybe as a car hop, but I wouldn't claim that I met her.
Yeah. So during that time when this investigation and everything was going on, were you staying up there in Izard County or were you driving back and forth? Like, what did your day-to-day look like?
I was at a newspaper in Salem. And I don't know if you're familiar with Salem.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's about a 20 to 25 minute drive, depending upon how bad the curves are. And So I would go back and forth from my office, and I lived in Hardy, so it wasn't like it was about a 35 to 40-minute drive. So I was in the area, but yeah, I was down there every day. I was in Guyan just outside of Melbourne where this all went down.
Yeah.
I went
Stone
to
County, yeah.
Yes. I went to Casey's trail, which is really funny. I went to his trailer house, the one that everybody's talked about on all these podcasts. When I went down there was crime scene tape around the trailer and not a soul there. I could have just crawled over the tape and went right in that house.
Wow. So Helen Gone did this case for season 1. Were you involved in that in any way?
Absolutely. So what happened is Catherine Townsend, the woman who started Helen Gone, she was working for the Discovery Channel, and she had read a bunch of stories that I'd written about Rebecca's case. So in March of 2018, she contacted me and said, "Hey, I want to do a podcast." I said, "Okay." She said, "Would you do interviews?" And I said, "Sure." So her and a producer and some other person came from New York or LA, whichever place. She lives in both places, so who knows? They came to Arkansas. They implanted down here for about a month and a half. I did a series of interviews with them. And then Catherine and I became friends, common cause, because I had written about Rebecca's case in my books, wanted it solved. So, and I was a good sounding board for her. Like, she had ideas and we would talk, go back and forth, and a lot of elements in the show that you hear, like when the guy that Casey allegedly confessed to, like when you hear that audio that she plays in one of the episodes, I heard that raw. I was out walking my dogs one day and she called me and said, "You got to listen to this." And I listened to it and she goes, "You think this guy's telling the truth?" I said, "Yes, I do. There's some truth to what he's saying." So, anyway, and then in 2018, Dr. Oz featured Helen Gone. Dr. Gould went to New York, was on the show. At the time, of course, I write a lot about politics too.
Yeah.
I was at AETN. I was a panelist, like they do the live TV interviews or debates with the different candidates. So I was down there doing candidate debates, like they had a governor's race and Senate and all that. And so every 2 years, I'm down there doing those. And so that the same day that he was on Dr. Oz, I was down there doing that. And he's texting me. He's like, "Man," he goes, "I really wish you were here right now." And I'm like, "Sorry, man, I had other obligations, But then Helen Gone launched the next day, I believe. I believe that was a Tuesday. And then Wednesday it launched, and it became one of the most popular podcasts in the United States in 2018.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the things that lured me into the true crime space for sure. I just think that the way the story was told, it kind of feels like it's very immersive. It takes you along for the ride for sure. Leading up to that case, did you ever see yourself covering that type of journalism?
I thought it was a possibility. I mean, I think that I'm pretty well known in the true crime space. I think that's fair because I've written 3 true crime books and I've covered so many cases. But I always tell people, in all honesty, I enjoy writing about a lot of different things. I write a lot about agriculture. I do a lot of history. Some of the celebrities that are from this area, I've done a lot of stories with. Not even from this area, people from around. Which I think those are just cool stories to do, just to hear stories about. I like talking to CEOs, like guys who are worth tons of money. Like, "Hey, how did you become who you are?" I love those stories. But the thing that most people ask me questions about, want to know about, I get constant Facebook messages or Instagram, is always true crime, which I don't mind. It's tough. I mean, it's not an easy thing to write about. Like if you watch a show on TV, there's element, like you're watching it, it's kind of it's entertaining and they've packaged it together. But when you've got to look a mom in the face and know that she's never going to see her child again, and you have to ask her a tough question. One of the toughest things I've ever had to do, and this actually wasn't a murder case, but it was a woman whose son had drowned in the South Fork River. He was 4 years old. And I knew that they had found him or found some evidence of him. And the police were bringing her across a bridge. And this case made national news. And I tell people this all the time. That case only made national news because there was kind of like a void in the news cycle, like nothing was going on. And this little boy vanishes, in rural Arkansas. And but he had drowned, and I had to walk right up to her the moment she found out that they had found evidence that he was gone. They hadn't actually found his body yet. But I had to walk right up to her and I had a camera, and I took a picture of her closer than I'm even standing to you right now. And that's just part of the job. And some people don't understand that. the thing about it is those raw emotional moments, those are the moments that compel other people to action. You know what I mean? Like I covered a case where one of my wife's students who she got raped and murdered. And I got a lot of flack for coverage of it because people were mad that I wrote about it in one of my books and that I covered it. And I said, well, here's the problem. That girl was being abused long before she got raped and murdered, and nobody did anything about it. So it should be used as a cautionary tale. You know what I mean? Like if you don't talk about it, no one will know.
So one thing that I've always wondered, what is the relationship like between the police and like people of the media? So how much did you know about the investigation that came from the police?
Well, if you're talking about Rebecca's case, not much because they weren't releasing much. They kept everything under seal, basically. So, Tevin, in the state of Arkansas, and it's like this in a lot of states, if a case is open and active, they don't have to release anything out of the case file. They can keep that all under wraps. Now, I think that that's probably valuable for the first several years of investigation. But when you get to about year 5 and nothing's really happened, I don't really think that I think that at that point that some of that stuff should be released by state law. Now, it's not, but here's what happened is I start digging around because the police talk to people. I go talk to those same people. I find out what they said to the police. So then I'm starting to get an insight into what's going on. And then every now and then somebody within the organization will leak something that's in the case file. Well, it got to the point where so much of that case file had been leaked out. There was only a couple things in there that were not publicly known to me. And for a long time, I never wrote about it. I'm not anti-police. I'm just anti-bad police, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? I got lots of friends who are cops, come on. So I will say this, media and police do have an adversarial relationship to a degree, and it's supposed to be that way. That's the way our founders founded it. We're supposed to be the check on government power, and police are agents of the government. People don't seem to quite get that in their head. And so when they do a good job, George writes a story about, hey, how great they are. When they do a bad job, I do the same thing. And it's always equal. I told a sheriff one time, a good friend of mine, he got elected sheriff. He'd been a detective. And I told him, I said, this is how this is going to work. The first 99 times I walk through that door, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to write a story about how your guys busted a drug dealer, how they solved a rape case, how they put a murderer behind bars, how they solved a bank robbery. I said, and then one night, one of your deputies is going to get drunk, jump in a car, and go run over 3 people. And I'm going to write about that just the same as I wrote about the other 99. And guess what? You're going to be mad, and everything I write after that's going to be fake news or whatever, whatever name they come up with. Whenever you disagree with something in news now, it's fake. It's like, no, it's not fake. You just don't agree with it.
Yeah, so you said that you kind of had like a strained relationship with the sheriff after, you said you were calling him out. What did that look like going forward during that time?
Well, so what happened is I called him out. Now, I'm not a timid person. And some journalists are, even good ones, tend to be a little more timid. I'm not. I will get right in your face. Don't care. And with him, I was fair to him. I always try to be fair. Now, you got to be professional and fair. Now, there was one interesting dynamic about him. He was getting ready to retire in December. So I only had to deal with him for another couple of months. And I personally liked the guy, just to be clear. And I blew him up. I mean, it was all over TV. It was bad. His brother was the sheriff in Fulton County, which was next door. His brother retired 2 years after this. When he retired, he came up and gave me a hug and said, you are the best and most fair-minded person I've ever dealt with in the media. His own brother said that to me. So even though I was tough, I was still fair.
Just some of the things that you've been saying, it sounds like a movie. I'm like, man, this is your real life. These are things that you're actually dealing with. And it's kind of just blowing my mind right now. So you're also known for the West Memphis 3.
Yes.
So you've written multiple books on that, correct?
Yeah. I've written one book on that.
Okay, one on that.
But I wrote over 100 news stories. I wrote more news stories about that case than any journalist in the world. And the only reason I know that is the Paradise Lost directors, Joe Bernlinger and Bruce Sinofsky. Bruce has passed away a couple years ago because of he was diabetic. But I would deal with those guys a lot. And finally one day I asked Bruce, I said, when you guys come to town, why do you always come and talk to me? Because they would come, they interviewed me for one of their documentaries. They set up boom mics at the courthouse. We were in there for a day and a half just doing interviews. And I would take them around, like they wanted to go whammy the jury foreman in the case, like they wanted me to lure them like to a restaurant. And they were going to jump in with all the cameras.
Yeah.
And I said, guys, I can't do that. I mean, I got to keep some integrity here.
Yeah.
But I asked him, I said, so why are you always talking to me? And he just kind of looked at me like surprised. He goes, no one's ever written more about this than you. And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah. And this was even before I did my death row interview with Damien Echols. I was on the precipice of doing that interview. It was coming up and they knew it. And that's why they had come to talk to me. They're like, hey, when you get done with that interview, we want to interview you again for the doc. And I was like, okay, no big deal. That was kind of a strange deal. So I was writing about I'll tell you how I can't make this up. So in 2008, there's this horrible tornado that goes all the way into you might remember it. It was like the second longest continuous track tornado ever in history. It ended in Highland, Arkansas, 5 miles from my house where I was living at the time. Well, there was a rumor a couple months later, they were trying to clean up from the devastation from this tornado, that Oprah Winfrey was going to come and do one of her community giveaways. Like she would show up at a town and
you get a car. Yeah.
You get a whole town. Here's your town back. You know? That's what Oprah would do. And so coincidentally, my daughter, who was a really little kid at this time, she's playing like t-ball, softball, whatever. She had a game in Highland that afternoon. And so I had, and I hope my former editor is not listening right now. If you are, Maria, sorry. I did lie to you. So I told her, I said, I heard that Oprah had already picked another town in Kentucky that she was going to do the thing. It was between Highland and Kentucky, and she'd gone there. But there was still a chance. So I said, hey, I better be in Highland. If Oprah shows up and I'm not there, how bad is that going to look for us? I was working at the Jonesboro Sun at the time. And she goes, yeah, you better go. She's looking at me like, And I was like, see ya. So I go down there. I'm at the game, obviously. And she calls me and says, call me back right now. And I said, okay. Well, then she texts me. She goes, hey, I need you to cover a hearing at the Craighead County Courthouse tomorrow for the West Memphis 3. I said, okay. And my buddy was sitting next to me. And I said, hey, what's the West Memphis 3? Like I had watched the documentary, but I'd forgotten about it. So that night I went home. I did a little research. I'm like, okay, I remember that doc I watched from 1996. And so the next morning I go to court. It's a 20-minute court hearing. Damien Echols at the time is represented by Dennis Reardon, who was Barry Bonds' attorney in the Balco steroids case. So
wow.
Yeah, he's the guy. I always tell people if money is no object, he's based in San Francisco. Obviously, he's the best at what he does in the world. And so I'm on the elevator with this guy, and I'm like, you're not going to talk at all? And he goes, no, the judge gagged me. And I directly quote him in the story. But what he did do is he had a big legal notepad, and he wrote down a cell phone number, tore it off, and he handed it to me. He says, there might be some other things we might need to talk about sometime. I said, okay. So I had his number, and I would call him periodically to get kind of like like what was really going on behind the scenes. And of course, some of that stuff, eventually started leaking into stories I was doing because I just couldn't, control it. And so people in the case, like Terry Hobbs and some of these other guys who were connected would call me because they were trying to figure out what was going on behind the scenes. And so I was writing about the case, writing about it. And then in 2011, they decided they were going to give him a new evidentiary hearing, which was a big deal. And so on August 18th, 2011, I'm sitting there. I'd already done the interview with Echols the year before. I did a whole series of stories. I'd interviewed Jason a bunch. I'd interviewed Jesse Miskelly Jr., the third defendant in that case, several times. I've been in the courtroom with them too a lot. And they would bring in guys like Dr. Richard Suverin, who was the forensic oncologist who ID'd Ted Bundy, the serial killer. And I interviewed him. I'm like, hey, did they do it? And he looked at me, he said, absolutely not, George. This is crazy. Dr. Warner Spitz, he is the guy who writes all of the books that forensic pathologists study to become forensic all over the country and all over the world. He was on the Assassinations Commission for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and JFK. And he testified, said, this is crazy, it's bunk. Dr. Michael Bodden, who studied under Warner Spitz, who was also on the congressional commissions for both JFK and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he came and testified. He was the medical examiner for the city of New York for 11 years, the lead, like the top dog. I always tell people if the President of the United States were to get assassinated tomorrow, he'd be in the room autopsying the body. He's one of those guys.
So what are you thinking, like, when you're doing all these interviews and, like, you're in the courtroom? Did you ever imagine that you would be here not as an attorney, but, you know, as a journalist?
You know, it's funny. I have a lot of friends who are attorneys. I got some friends that are judges. I would never, ever trade my life for theirs, ever. Because I get it's kind of like the cream of what happens in the courtroom. Like you go in and we're going to have a murder trial. Well, just imagine the stress you're under for 6 months, whether you're the defense attorney or the prosecutor. You're building a case. You're every day and night. You're just worrying about every little thing. George shows up, and I just go in there and say, "Hey, let me take notes of all the work you guys have done, and then I'm going to go and write a story about it." So I get the best part of being an attorney without having to do all the hard work. I guess I'm lazy. I guess what I'm trying to say.
No, I mean, it's just fascinating just hearing some of these experiences. So, you've done journalism for how long at this point?
When I started with West Memphis 3, they got released on August 19th, 2011, and I broke that story, by the way. I beat the New York Times, I think, by 2 hours. I think that's what I was told.
Wow.
Yeah. And at that time, I'd been a journalist for about 7 years, almost exactly 7 years.
That's crazy. So you cover this case. You said that you have written more about this case than anyone else in the world. When does this transition into you being an author? Like, when do you start thinking, hey, I'm going to write a book about some of this stuff?
Well, okay, so I remember the day I got done with West Memphis 3. They had released them. I was in the courtroom when they got released. They only let 20 journalists in the room, and there were journalists from all over the world that wanted in there. But they came out and told us we're only letting 20 in.
How did you get to be in the top 20?
I might have had some pull somewhere.
Yeah.
Might have, just like, you don't want me hanging out outside the courtroom getting mad, writing stories about how you guys aren't letting me in there. And you guys are all local. You'll still be here tomorrow, and so will I. So I actually don't know how they decided. I just know that they started letting people in, and I was the fourth one they let in. The journalists had to sit in the jury box, and they had a pull camera set up, and then they let somebody from the Associated Press in, from the Democrat Gazette. New York Times was there. CNN had their number one guy there. All that, and then there's me,
George Jarrett's there.
Yeah, me, Clown George is there. Yeah. So I was there. It was funny. I'll never forget it because they chose a really small courtroom on purpose because there were thousands of people out there, Tevin. I mean, this place, it was insane. It was like a rock concert. And I'm like, what is going on? Well, they were only going to they chose a really tiny courtroom that only about 150 people would fit in. They were only going to let people who were related to the victims or the three defendants in the courtroom. So I get in there. And, it's like before they're about to start the official proceedings. So I'm just wandering around in the courtroom. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, the lead singer, he's in there. Natalie Maines from the Dixie Chicks, she's sitting there. And I walked up to Eddie Vedder, which I had met him several times in connection with this case. I looked at him, I said, how are you related to anybody in this case? He goes, I don't know. He goes, I just pay the bill. He's like some crazy, I guess I just help pay the bills because he had given millions of dollars to try to help get these guys out. And I always tell people, I've met him a few times. For a guy that anytime he goes into a concert hall and there's, 50,000 people trying to get their hands on him, he is a really nice guy. Just a down-to-earth, nice guy. In fact, I took my wife one time to one of his concerts, and it was a fundraising concert that he did in Little Rock. And he was like, hey, you should go to that. And I was like, And my wife, she didn't want to go. Well, she meets him. I introduced her to him. And she goes, he's, not a physically imposing guy.
Yeah.
And she goes, I don't see what's so special about that guy. Well, we get to the concert and he starts singing a cappella on the stage. And she looked at me, she goes, oh my God, that sound is coming out of that man. And I said, you figured it out.
Yeah.
I actually there's a picture of him and Johnny Depp playing. Johnny Depp is playing guitars with Eddie Vedder. There's actually there's a picture out there And I took it. I actually got on the side of the stage because I thought, who knew that Johnny Depp was like this big time musician? Well, come to find out, he was a big time musician. And he actually had given, I don't know how much money, millions of dollars to the West Memphis Three. Met him a couple times. He actually sent my daughter a video back after these guys get released. So they have this is in 2017. I was covering the executions on death row. They were going to have a whole series of executions. Well, Damien Echols and Johnny Depp had come back to Arkansas to protest against them. So I'm at the Capitol. I can't make this up. So we're at the Capitol, burning hot. Like, I'm talking sweat like you wouldn't believe. Thousands of people around the Arkansas Capitol building. People are up there protesting. They're mad. This is the week before the first execution. Well, then I look over underneath a tree and I see Damien Echols standing there with Johnny Depp and Lori Davis, who is Damien's wife. And I know her very well. Back when he was still on death row, I would go and eat dinner with her. I'd communicate with her, all that kind of stuff. So I walk over to him and I'm like, Damien Echols. And he goes, George Jared. I said, what are you doing here? And he goes, I take that back. I said, I haven't seen you in a while. And he goes, I don't come back to Arkansas much. And he goes, do you blame me? And I was like, probably not.
So you're finishing up with that case, and now you're getting ready to start writing. Like, what's that like? Writing your books, I mean.
After that case, I started really contemplating if I wanted to stay being a journalist, because it's not high paying. I've always done things on the side to like make money, but at this point I had 2 kids, and you start thinking about, okay, this is cool, but is this really paying the bills the way you could be paid? My wife is a wealthy teacher, so you know how that goes. So I really thought about going into a different line of work. Well, then the Elliott murders came around. The 2 capital murder trials for the Elliots. They were accused of wiping out a family of 4 in Dalton, Arkansas in 1998. And I said, okay, they're gonna have one in September of 2011. So I go from West Memphis 3 getting released on August 19th. 2 weeks later, the first capital murder trial for these guys are heinous. What they did to this family is just unconscionable. So it starts. Well, then 6 months after that, the father, Chad Green, went first, the son, and then the father was going to have his trial 6 months later. I said, okay, I'm going to stay in this for another 6, 8, 10 months. I'm going to get through these 2 trials, and then I'm going to decide what I'm going to do with my life. Well, I get through those. And then right after that, my wife, Sydney Randall, her student, just a few months after this other trial, she vanishes. And I knew Sydney. She was in between the ages of my kids. And so they find her body a few months later. Well, I'm just kind of stuck in this quagmire where I have to keep covering these cases because I'm in the middle of it. Well, then finally I'm like, okay, I'm going to write a book. And
what year was this?
Probably 2014.
2014, okay.
And I talked to a really good friend of mine. We went out and ate lunch one day, and I said, I'm going to write a book. I just don't know what about. And he looked at me, and he's like, let's see, you covered the most famous criminal case ever. You've already done all the interviews. You have all the material done. All you got to do is write the book, right? And I go, yeah. And he goes, for a smart guy, you're pretty dumb. And I was like...
Okay, so you decided you're going to write this book. How long did that process take you from beginning to end to start and complete the book, your first book?
From beginning to end, okay, so I started in 2014. I actually started writing my first 2 books, bits and pieces of them. My idea was I was going to write this huge anthology. Like every chapter would be a different case. Like long, like big, huge, all-encompassing chapter. So I started writing both of my books at the same time. Well, I had an editor, a professional editor, look at it, and he's like, no. He said, you can't do that. He said, the West Memphis 3 is it's its own thing. It's got to be by itself. And I said, okay, which really changed my calculation because I was trying to fit everything into a chapter, which he was right. You can't do that. There's too much in that case. It takes too long. So I sat around for about 2 weeks after this. And then I decided I hated my job because I did not like my editor at the time. So I just decided I'm just going to quit. I walked in, I wrote this horrendous resignation letter. First I wrote this email saying basically if you'd quit, I'd stay. but if you don't quit, I'm leaving. And so I went on a trip to Florida for about 4 days and came back. He came up to my desk. He's like, we need to talk. I said, okay, because I was bad. Well, then we had another conversation with me, him, and the publisher that didn't go over very well. So I'm like, I'm done. So I wrote about a 3-page resignation letter detailing every reason why I couldn't stand this guy and why he was there, why I was leaving. And I sent it to everybody in the organization. Just so
wow.
Yeah. Needless to say, that dude has behaved himself completely after this. But I didn't have a job. I had no job, nothing. And I just decided, you know what? This is what I'm going to have to do. And I didn't get on unemployment. I didn't do none of that stuff. I spent 8 months with no job, nothing. And I wrote that book.
So was there any like sense of panic? Like, I don't have a job right now. It's either this book or nothing. Like, take me through what those 8 months were like for you.
It's exactly what you just said. Here's the thing. I thought that I used to get up to work for other people. Like, I thought, okay, I get out of bed, it's time to go work for someone else. When you work for yourself like that, when you have an idea in your head that you don't know if it'll ever make a dime, you don't have it. You get up, dude, I'm talking 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm sitting at my desk and we're grinding all day long. Grind 12 hours. Write something, this sucks, write it again, write it again. And, at this point, I'd made a living writing for many years. So I finally, I quit in September of 2015. By March of 2016, my book was out. So I got it done. And then that's when things started happening.
Okay, so I've always been interested in this. So take me through the process. How do you take it from you're writing this to it getting published? And how do you make money off of a book? What does that entire process look like?
Well, publishing is actually a really interesting industry. A lot of people don't make any money when they write books. That's one thing. A lot of people come up and ask me like, hey, what can I do to make money on a book? And I'm like, well, it's hard to make money. John Grisham is actually from Jonesboro. Most people don't know that.
Yeah.
But, he's made almost $1 billion or some crazy figure with all of his books. But if you look at how many books he sold, he makes like 50 cents a book. I mean, so I always try to tell people who want to write that my experience is not always the best, like, what's the word? Daguerreotype maybe or template, because true crime is just a different kind of entity. West Memphis 3 is just its own thing. I always tell people my second book did way better than my first book, which shocks a lot of people. But my second book was the one I actually wanted to write. I was like, if I wanted to write a true crime book, it was my second book, The Creekside Bones, because the first book was about the West Memphis 3. Okay. But I'd written so much about it. There was so much about it out there. I wrote about 4 separate cases in my second book, and those cases were not well known, but they were very heinous. I mean, heinous. And people have told me, I've had many times I've been at book signings, or I go and do a lot of book talks. I go to museums, libraries, bookstores. I did a book signing at a winery one time, which was really awesome. Did one at the casino. I mean, just been to a lot of different places.
Yeah.
But I've had people come to me and say, I've had nightmares about that book. I can't get over it. And I won't name who it is. I had a woman who was related to one of the victims that I wrote about in the second book. She said she read it, and then she tore that book to pieces with her bare hands and threw it in the trash because she couldn't even stand for those words to be in her house.
My goodness. So in that book, are these all cases that you covered?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to have to read that book. So you finished your book. You took me through like a roller coaster there when you were talking about, a lot of people don't make money on books. So you said you're getting up, you're grinding 5 a.m. You're working for yourself for 8 months straight. Like, what was it like when you finally finished the book? Like, what happened then?
Okay. So now this is, and I do tell prospective authors this. You don't make a lot of money in bookstores. You will make some money. Like, I have a lot of people like who just want walk up to me like at the gym. Will say, hey man, can I get a copy of your book? Okay. You'll make money like that. Where you make money selling books is on Amazon. And I hate that, Amazon's this big, huge conglomerate now that everybody hates. But I promise you, when they start sending you royalty checks for every month, you'll cash them. And so Amazon is really the way to go. I mean, I would do a book signing. I've done book signings everywhere. When people call me and ask me. I've got 2 book signings coming up here pretty soon for my latest book that's out. And I always accept them no matter how much I think I'll make if I go. I mean, sometimes I go and it's great. Sometimes I go and it's not so great. I mean, it's a crapshoot. I will say this. I've gone to some that I thought were going to be awful and turned out, knocked it over the fence. Others, not so much. So
just take me through, like, I've never been to a book signing. So people buy your book on the spot and get you to sign it? Like,
yes.
Okay.
What they do, I'll use Barnes & Noble. Our Barnes & Noble got wiped out by the tornado. So I did several book signings there. They would call and say, hey, would you consider doing a book signing? I'm like, okay. So what you do is you'll set up a day and a time. You go and sit, and they'll have all your books on display. You sit there, they come and they buy it, you sign it, and then they go through the cash register and they buy the book, and then, that's how the process moves. And then you get a certain percentage of whatever sold that day. So it's a good deal for you. You don't have to worry about any other thing. You just sit there and sign books. And my first signing at Barnes & Noble went so well, they asked me if I'd come back again just for the same book. And I was like, okay. And I'm like, what day? And they're like, I could tell she didn't want to say it, but it was like the next day. Like it was a Saturday. She would come back Sunday. And I said, yeah, I can do that. I lived here in town. I was like, yeah, I'd come up here and do that. And a friend of mine came up there and sat with me and just signed books. I mean, I've had lines where I've been sitting there for hours. And people ask me all the time, like, why my signature looks so awful. It's because if you look at a line after, like I spoke at a museum one time. Well, there was only about 100, 125 people there. But as soon as I got done, every single one of them got in line. And I'm like looking down there going, oh my God.
Yeah, you're about to have to sign
at least 100 autographs. And that takes time.
Okay, so you said your second book did better than your first book. But the success of your first book, ultimately set you to where, you are today. So you said you make a lot of money on Amazon. Did it do well on Amazon? Was that your main avenue that you sold your first book on?
Yes, for the most part. I'd have to go back and look, but I did a lot of book signings for the first book. That book is so, people are so interested in that case. Like I never called to set up a book signing. People were calling me all the time. My second book, I did a lot less book signings, but the Amazon sales. And the thing I tell authors about Amazon, like that aspect, book signings are fun. Don't get me wrong. If you ever do one, if you ever write a book, you'll enjoy it. But there's also some value in the fact that if you sell a book on Amazon, they take care of everything. They just send you a check.
Yeah. So what was your life like after you wrote the book? What did your work, your everyday look like? How long was it between the first book and the second book?
I've always tried to be like a proactive in my life. Like I always try to think ahead, look ahead. So after about 2 months of the first book, and it did well. I don't want to shortchange what it did because that would be disingenuous. It did well. And then I immediately said, okay, I've got to finish the second book now because I already had about 75% of it written. And, the funny thing is when you do something the first time, you learn you learn the mistakes, the pitfalls, that other stuff. Like with my first book, I actually turn like some people down to like go and speak and do that kind of stuff. And that was a mistake. I should have went, because you can't judge these things. I can't make this up. I went to a flea market one time. My mother-in-law just begged me to go to this flea market. She goes, they were doing this thing and they needed somebody there to sit by the front door. And they thought, oh, well, if you're here with that book, people will come in. I cannot tell you how many people came to that door and bought that book. It was unbelievable.
That's incredible. That's one place I would never think that people are going to be looking for a book, especially like a true crime book. So during that time after your first book, did you get a job or were you just still in writing mode?
I was still in writing mode. I had my second book. I was lining it up. And then I got a call from a really good friend of mine named Roby Brock. And he owns Talk Business and Politics in Little Rock. And Roby and his partner, Michael Tilley, another really awesome dude that I work for now, They said they were looking for someone, they needed a writer and someone who lived in Northeast Arkansas because they wanted to expand. They were in the Fayetteville area. They owned the Northwest Arkansas Business or Northwest Arkansas Business Journal. They were in Little Rock with the Talk Business and Politics TV show. They had the City Wire in Fort Smith. Well, they wanted to start something up here. So he said, "Hey, are you looking for a job?" And I said, "Absolutely not." He actually called me. I was at the trim gym. And I said, "Nope." I said, "Not interested." And he's like, "Well, let's just talk about it." And I said, "Okay." So I met up with him and Michael at a Chamber of Commerce one morning. And we went in there and we were just talking, going back and forth. And then he just asked me what it would take. And I just told him what it would. And he agreed to everything I asked for. And Tracy said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I guess I'm going to have to go write about business and politics for these guys." And that was in probably the summer of 2016. I took about a month off. I took a trip to Florida and I was off for about a month. I was in Miami for a while. And then I came back and I started working for them. And I've loved working for them. Great guys. Also helps keep me in the loop on a lot of stuff, especially in politics and business going on around here. Get to write a lot about agriculture, stuff like that. Plus, we also started a magazine, which I had wanted to do, which I had pitched for a while. I think a magazine would go over here. And the magazine's done great. And so...
what's the magazine called?
It's called Talk Business and Politics Northeast Arkansas Edition. And it's very similar. It's a tabloid-style magazine. We put it out once a month. We actually direct mail it to the people who are subscribers. So and it's free. So if you sign up for it, like on our website, we'll just mail it to your house. I mean, you'll get it. And I have people coming in. It's funny. I'll be at the gym. Somebody come in holding that magazine. They're like, "I didn't know you wrote for this magazine." I'm like, "Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of part of the deal." So it's also another creative outlet for me if I have, my friend Paulie Litt, Paulie from the gym. And, Paulie was a childhood actor. Most people don't know anything about all that. And so I'm like, "Hey, I'm going to put you in my magazine." I had no other place where I could write about him. And I wrote about him, and that story just grew legs and ran all over the world. A friend of mine contacted me one Saturday, like 2 weeks after it launched, and he said, "That's the number one story on Reddit." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's the number one story on Reddit." And then my boss called and said, "We've never had traffic on a story like this ever."
That's crazy. So that's currently where you're employed now?
Yes.
Okay, so take me through what a regular day, like what does your day look like throughout the week? Because I met you in the gym. I had taken off work that day. So it was like 8:30 on a Monday. So does your schedule, is it flexible? Is it, vary? Like, do you have to go into an office? What does it look like?
No, I don't go into an office. That was part of the deal. I wanted to work from home. I set my own hours. I have complete autonomy over my life. I set my schedule. Like every now and then one of my bosses will call and say, "Hey, can you, like the bridge in West Memphis is about to collapse in the Mississippi River. Can you go over there and write a story about it?" Which when they call about something like that, I'm already on it because I want to write about that, So like I get up, I'm an early riser. I get up, you see me at the gym a lot early in the morning. Sometimes I get up and write though. I've always got projects going on all the time. I've always got a book project going on. I've always got, obviously, the podcast I started with Andrew Brown, Diamond State Murder Board. We're always lining up episodes. My true crime partner, Jennifer Buchholz, who lives in Colorado Springs, her and I are constantly talking to family members and police, and we're working on 4 or 5 different things behind the scenes because, that's how when something happens, you're able to know about it before it happens. In Rebecca's case, the state police hadn't even announced. They arrested him on a Saturday night, which was my birthday, by the way. Happy birthday to me. And they arrested him. Well, as of Monday morning, they hadn't even said that they had arrested a guy. And I just broke it to social media. I already knew. I had a smoke shot and everything. I knew they didn't have any idea that I knew. And so I broke it. And of course, so I've always got something going on in the background. The thing I tell people, working from home is rough if you're not organized. Like you've got to wake up every day with a plan for every single day. And this is the thing you got to be careful about. And my wife yells at me about this a lot. Sometimes I work 7 days a week and I can't stop. Like I'll just be sitting here. I'll be here just writing and writing and writing and writing. And I just, sometimes I have to take a break.
Yeah. So I've got a few questions that some of my followers on Instagram were wanting me to ask you. So one of them is, how do you judge your success in writing?
I judge my success in writing by how many people have read the things I've written. I mean, and that sounds like a kind of a non-answer. So like when I know, like that story with Paulie, he's a buddy of mine. When that story grew legs and ran all over the place, it just made me feel good because I knew I wrote that. You know what I mean? Like people read it, I don't like, one time I was in a bookstore and I walked by and a lady was sitting on a chair. This was out of town, like not even near here. I didn't even know this bookstore was carrying my book. And I look over and she's reading a copy she has it in her hand. And I wanted to take a picture of her, but then I thought, she'd think I was a creeper and she'd, call the cops or whatever. One day, somebody that I was friends with on Facebook that I didn't even know was in like Charleston, South Carolina, and they were in a bookstore. They took a picture of at a bookstore of just books on a shelf, and 2 of the books on the shelf were mine. And I was like, man. Or my daughter one time sent me a picture. She had seen my books somewhere. She goes, I didn't know your book was in here, Dad. And she was out with her boyfriend and they just saw it. So I like it when people read the stuff I write, I mean, it's kind of the deal,
Yeah. That's awesome. Just, being able to go into a Barnes and Noble and you're like, man, I wrote that book. So the next question, have you ever felt in danger from covering a case?
Yeah. I've had calls from the pen, state penitentiary, some of the stuff I write out, people don't, like when you start writing about somebody who may or may not be a murderer, if they are a murderer, they really don't like that because they're free right now. And, sometimes journalists have a hand in making sure that those, scumbags who need to go to jail, go to jail. So I got rid of my hard line in my house, but this is the thing I tell people. I tell young journalists, you can't be afraid. You're only going to live this one time anyway. You just go do the job. This is the job you've signed up for. I've written about drug busts. I've written about, like cartels. I've written about, I've written about everything. There's nothing that you can imagine that I have not written about. And if there's a criminal element to it, I say it. I wrote a series of stories that led to a guy going straight to federal prison. I mean, sorry, don't break the law and I won't write about you.
Wow. Yeah, that's intense. So, and the last question I have, has there ever been a case that's kept you up at night?
A lot of them, Rebecca's case did for sure, but the Elliott murders, that case started with a knock at the door on a rainy night. Friend needed help with his car. And then within an hour, mom, dad, and little boy are slaughtered like animals. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean that literally. And the little 8-year-old girl was taken. And I still have like a worksheet that she filled out when her last day of school. It's sitting in my file right here in this room. And that case I didn't realize it at the time, but I would scream in my sleep because the details are just, they'll kill you. I watched 2 juries have to go. It was interesting. So a father and son were convicted in the killing of this family of 4. Virtually the same case was brought against both of them. So I'm in a courtroom for weeks on end, seeing the exact same case for the most part play out. And what was interesting in the father, when he was tried, he actually testified in his own defense, which I couldn't believe because you just don't see that. Defendants in capital murder cases very rarely get on the stand. It just doesn't happen. And I was there for that one. And I always tell people when I talk about the Creekside Bones, it started, I described how it started. I always say that book, that first chapter, the first 2 chapters, you have never read a horror novel worse. You've never seen a scarier movie than what really happened to a family of 4 in Dalton, Arkansas in 1998.
I'm going to have to get a copy of your book for sure. So one thing that I've always been wondering about is storytelling. So you seem to be a very good storyteller. What are some tips? Like, how do you get better at acquiring that skill?
Okay, and that's actually a really good question. And I actually teach. I've actually taught classes to teachers, like their continuing education. My wife has actually been a student in one of my summer classes before. Okay, if you and I are sitting here having a conversation, like I've interviewed a lot of people, you're going to say 1 or 2 things to me that are going to stand out above the rest of everything else you just said. People have really short attention spans. So a lot of times people, when they meet me, almost one of the first things I will always say to them is, oh yeah, I wrote about the West Memphis Three. And the reason I say that is because it's a qualifier. People go, oh, you wrote about the West Memphis Three, and people know what that case is. It's not that it was the most interesting case I ever wrote about. It's just simply the one that people know. So I always say that. So like if I'm talking to you for the first time and you'll tell me one or two interesting things about yourself, if you're having a conversation with someone, the thing that interested you the most is most likely going to be the thing that interests your listeners or your readers the most. So you always push that to the top of the story. You frame the top like that. Like I did a story one time with a guy named Bob Durer. Bob is you know Bob Durer, and you don't even know who I'm talking about right now, do you?
No, I have no idea.
Bob Durer created all the Schoolhouse Rock cartoons. Conjunction Junction, What's Your Function?
Bill on Capitol, yeah.
A Bill on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
Okay. He wrote all those songs. I'm the last person to do a story with him before he passed away. And people always ask me, who's the most famous person you've ever been around or interviewed? And I've been around as famous as people as you can possibly be around. I always say Bob, because Bob, if you ask a 5-year-old now or a 50-year-old, they've all heard those songs. And so I wrote that story. Well, how I started that story was Bob was a very famous jazz pianist. He played with Miles Davis back in the day. You know, Miles let him record some with him, which was very rare. He didn't record with a lot of artists. Bob was actually from Arkansas, and no one knew it because he moved away when he moved away with the military because he was in that brass band that would always play.
Yeah.
So how I started that story was I said, Bob, how in the world did you come up with all these songs for Schoolhouse Rock? He said an ad executive in New York City called him one day and said, hey, Bob, I need to write a song for my son so he can learn his multiplication tables. He said, I don't want a jingle. He had a bunch of jingle writers like Finger Licking Good. You know, it's like a 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So he goes, I don't want that. And Bob goes, okay. He goes, give me a week. Let me come up with something. So he comes back a week later and he wrote a song called 3 is the Magic Number. And the guy's like, oh man, he goes, we can make an album full of songs like this. So they make the album. And then Michael Eisner, who created Disney basically, you know, back when Disney became Disney, he was the CEO at Disney. Well, he was the programming director at ABC Mornings, and he was their cartoon guy. Like he was in charge of their lineup, and their lineup sucked. So he heard the album, and he immediately turned to his assistant and goes, we're going to turn these into cartoons. And so they brought Bob in. They hired a full orchestra. He wrote a lot of the songs, a lot of the lyrics. And that voice you hear is just this little skinny dude from Arkansas. And, you know, that stuff that gives you goosebumps even to this day as a kid. It was him. And so he went all over the world, became world famous over this. And so that's how I started that story, because that is the most interesting thing that he told me, is how he got started with Schoolhouse Rock.
That is incredible, because that is one of the staples of my childhood, is listening to those songs in like 4th and 5th grade. You know, you have like a video day and they're playing Schoolhouse Rock, they're playing Conjunction Junction. Catch myself singing some of those songs still to this day. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's really cool. I mean, I'll never forget that. This has been a very, very interesting interview for sure. So can we talk about a little bit about your podcast for a second? So Andrew, you know, when he was first getting started in podcasting, he reached out to me because I've been doing a podcast for about 1.5 years or so. So how did that start for you guys?
Andrew and I were friends through the gym. Yeah. And, you know, he had listened to some podcasts that I had been a guest on. Yeah. And I'm not going to lie to you, I don't know how many times I've been a guest on a podcast. It's been a lot. I can't even remember them all. Sometimes I'll hear somebody else say, hey, I heard you on this podcast. I'm like, what are you talking about? I had a friend one time, I was on a BBC documentary. I had no clue. It was a documentary called Life in Death Row, because I was there for several executions and I would ask questions. Yeah. So anyway, Andrew was listening to a podcast I was on, and he came up to me at the gym. He said, hey, have you ever considered doing your own podcast? And I said, not at all. You know, because I'm thinking about all the work. How's this going to be? You know, I got so many things going on. Well, then finally one day, I was out walking my dogs. I was in a bad mood. And I just texted him and said, hey, let's just do it. And so he ran in the bathroom at work and called me back. And he's like, are you serious? I'm like, yeah. So we started recording. And I told him from the beginning, I said, I want to lay this form out like in, 3 pieces. I want to tell a little snippet of a story at the beginning. I want to give the meat, have a break, and then give the rest of the story at the end. Pretty simple format. And I said, we can cover cases I've covered, like I can pontificate on them, or my preference is to bring people in and interview them because that's kind of what I like to do. And so some of the episodes are just me riffing on cases that I've covered, which is fine. The case, it seems like the episodes that do a little better and that sound a little better are the ones where I have a guest, and I know a lot of my guests, I bring them in. I bring in guests from all over the country because I know people in all realms of this genre. We cover mostly murder cases, but we did do an episode which has actually done very well. I interviewed a guy who worked at Area 51. He was a physicist, a legit physicist, not the guys you see on, YouTube and all that other stuff who put like lab coats on and say, I worked at Area 51. This guy's like the real thing. And he lives in Hardy and he's retired. Legit scientist, great guy. So we did an episode on that. We did a Christmas episode with some crazy like Christmas crimes. And then, our first season went really well. I went and spoke at Crime Con a couple of weeks ago down in Austin, Texas.
Yeah. How was that?
It was really crazy. Dr. Phil was there. Nancy Grace came down.
So you met Dr. Phil, or?
Yeah, I said hi to him. I mean, it wasn't like we didn't go out and eat dinner or anything, Nancy Grace, I'm like,
Yeah.
I met Chris Henson from Dateline, the guy that pops out of the pantry when the guy thinks he's showing up to mess around with a 15-year-old. He goes, hi, I'm Chris Henson with Dateline.
Yeah.
Met him. He was a pretty cool guy, when you're in the space I'm in, don't get starstruck. I mean, there's just nobody. Got to see Barack Obama, 3 days before he became president, I was up in Springfield, Missouri, working as a journalist at the time, covering politics. And, when you see the first minority person who became president of the United States ever, when they write the history of this time, there's only going to be 1 or 2 people mentioned, and he will be one of them.
Yeah.
And so when you meet that guy, then, and I've met, like Bill Clinton, a bunch of times. I actually met George W. Bush when he was actually the governor of Texas at a business expo. I met his brother Jeb in a bathroom one time, which was, just over at Brig River Steel. He was just I see this tall guy walk in and I'm like, who is that guy? And my friend's like, that looks like Jeb Bush. And I'm like, that is Jeb Bush, you idiot.
Yeah, well, I definitely enjoy listening to your podcast every week. I actually just listened to the episode about the professionals episode. So it was really interesting seeing you talk about movies and the Zodiac, and the dynamic between you and Andrew is always fun to listen to for sure. Okay, so what is one piece of advice that you would give to an 18-year-old that's unsure about what they want to do next?
What I would say to an 18-year-old is, I've told both my kids this, you're born on a day and you will certainly pass away on a day. And in between those 2 days is a dash mark on your tombstone. And you better make sure you have a really nice dash because you only get to do this once. So if you really love something, then you just need to do it because, obviously you have to make money in life. We all do. Everyone does. But the thing about it is, no matter how much money you make, you'll never look back at your life and think, oh man, if I had just made, $1,000 more in, 2021, my life would have been so much different. Like if I had become an attorney, I'm sure I would have been a good one. I finished top 20 in moot court competition in college in the entire United States of America. You can look that up on the internet. Which I had a friend who doubted that, and so he had to go check it out. That was like last week, by the way, and I'm not going to mention who you are. But he looked and it was there. So, I'm sure I would have been good, and I probably would have made more money doing that, maybe, I don't know, than I do now. But I don't regret what I do. I love what I do. Every day I wake up, it's something completely different. I like telling stories. I like writing stories. So I would tell somebody, if you have a passion for something, then just make it happen. Don't make excuses. I always tell my kids, never tell me why you can't. Always tell me why you can.
Oh, that's really good advice. So the purpose of this podcast is to try to see how many different ways you can get to the same goal. So do you think it's necessary to have a college degree to become a writer or to get in the true crime space?
No, no, you don't. Here's the thing. If you want, if let's say that was your goal in life,
Yeah.
go ahead and try to get a degree in that space if you can, because it'll make it easier. But Tevin, you probably know this. I don't think it's any. I don't think this is any great big secret. When I got into a newsroom, and I worked for several news organizations through the years, I wasn't always the best writer there. I wasn't always the best reporter. In fact, there's a lot of times I think, man, why didn't you ask him that question? How could you screw this up? But I will say this, and I don't think I've worked with probably 50 or more journalists, probably 20 or more editors. I guarantee you can march every one of them in this room right now, and they'll tell you one thing. I was by far and away the most aggressive. Like, if I heard a story, I went for it. Even if it was on somebody else's beat, I'm like, are you going to cover that? Are you going to cover that? Are you busy today? You going to lunch? If you go to lunch, I'm going to take that story by the time you come back. But from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, when you come back at 1 o'clock, I'm going to be writing that story, and it's going to be on our website. So get ready. And I've just always approached it like that because at the end of the day, like I'm working for a company that primarily focuses on business and politics. I was never actually just a business or politics reporter every one time in my life, but I wrote a ton of business and politics because I'd hear a great Big River Steel when they came in Mississippi County back in 2014. I had the editors were like, hey, could we get somebody to go over there, cover that? I said, on it, jumped in my car and just left. It wasn't even on my beat. It had nothing to do. I didn't cover business. I didn't cover Mississippi County. But I went over there because I thought building a huge steel mill on the Mississippi River, that's got to be cool somehow. Well, that's where I met Jeb Bush, and I wrote a story about it. I won first place in the state of Arkansas in business reporting for the story I did on that Big River Steel plant.
Yeah. I mean, that's how did you become that way though? Like, have you always been like aggressive in everything? Did you always strive to be the best? Like, how do you become more like you?
It's in me. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I didn't have to make myself be this way.
Yeah.
Like, and I won't mention any names, but yesterday I got into it with a clerk on the phone in a county not too far from here because I was really mad about, some information they weren't releasing that they were supposed to. I've always been I've been aggressive. I like to play sports. I like to play basketball, things like that. I've never had a problem telling someone like no one ever has to wonder where they stand with me because I will tell you. But I think I'm kind of a truth teller. I'm just one of those kind of people, and I kind of feel like everybody should be that way. I don't know. I just, man, when you start a job or a career or profession, you quickly just figure out how the most successful person in that organization or in that field, how they do it, and just start mimicking their behavior. That's all I can say.
Yeah. So this is a question that I had also. So since you are a writer, do you feel like that it's hard for you to read things without judging it from a technical perspective?
No, I always, this is a key. So, I was not great at English in school. I was an average English student. So people are like, well, do you know exactly where to put a comma, or do you know all the tenses, exactly how to do all these types of mechanical things within the English language? The answer is no. That's why you hire editors because they will figure that stuff out. This is what I know. I guarantee you've read like books that you just loved, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I guarantee you could bring any book that you love to me and I could go through it. I could say, oh, that comma, that's a comma splice right there. Take that out. I could go through there with a red marker and start marking it up with all the errors. And I don't care if it's Simon and Schuster who published it. Okay. You never noticed that, did you?
No.
No, you wouldn't. I learned like some people every now and then would send me a message. Hey, I think you used a word wrong here in one of your books, blah, blah, blah. And I'd say, thank you very much for the note. I said, when we publish the next round, I'll make the correction if it needs to be. Most of the time it doesn't, actually. People don't understand. But I learned early on, nobody cares. I had an editor one time. So this school was closing down. And I went over there to cover the last night, their last graduation. They were closing down. It was over. I wrote a story. The story was gripping. People cried when they read it. It was very heartbreaking. I tell people the most horrible thing besides writing about a murder case is writing about a town losing their school. It's awful. Wrote the story. In the middle of the story, there was an egregious grammar error. I mean, it was bad. So my boss was just all kinds of mad. He came in there and he goes, "Man, you wrote this great story," he says, "but now it's in the newspaper." And he goes, "You win first place in education reporting with this story right here." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "But that error, it's over." I said, "Submit it." I said, "Let's just see if they even notice." I won first place for that story.
That's crazy, because I feel like that people that aren't writers, you see the people that are the grammar Nazis, and then you know you still were able to win an award first place with that error in there. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's incredible. Mm-hmm. So, if you were forced to change career paths, just completely do something different, what could you see yourself doing?
That's a really awesome question. I was in sales for a few years, and I had a knack for it. I really liked it.
Yeah.
I liked controlling my income and my time. That was really cool. I would probably get into some type of business like that. Probably do some like high-end sales, because I think I would enjoy that. Like, to be a reporter, you have to be able to talk to people. You have to be like, I can talk about anything. I can talk about sports, religion, politics, business. So, when you're in sales, you never know. Like, when I was in sales, like, I would walk into a business and I was in the marketing and advertising industry, and you never know what kind of person you're going to deal with. But if you have that kind of a background, you can kind of relate on different levels, and that always helps, and plus I'm married, have kids. So, I could relate. I can relate on all that kind of stuff too. I was very popular with middle-aged women. I'd go in there and they just wanted to talk about, how terrible their husbands were and all this other stuff. And I'm like, man, he sounds bad. Yeah. Now let's get back to the point here.
Oh man. So yeah, like I said, this has been a very insightful interview. What projects are you currently working on right now?
I've got a book project, which we actually don't even have a title for it, that I'm working on with a friend of mine. We've been working on it probably for 6 or 8 months now. And so it's kind of, she's written some of it, I've written some of it. We're going back and forth. So we're trying to figure that out. I released my first fiction book about a month ago called A Novel Wait.
Okay, yeah. So tell us a little bit about that. Is it in the true crime space? Is it something different, or?
Yes, it's. I actually co-wrote it with my daughter.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
She had some time off. She's actually a very, very good writer. And both of my kids I'm very honest with them. If they were good at something, I would tell them. If they were bad at something, I would tell them. And but she's a gifted writer. She's good at putting words together. So I said, hey, you want to try it? Which I wrote most of it, but when she had time, she wrote some. And it's kind of the journey of a journalist working through the pandemic. Like, I was reading a book called Pandemic 1918 before COVID started. So I would go to the gym and tell people what happened back in 1918 when the Spanish flu hit. People all wore masks. They had to social distance. They would send paddy wagons around and throw you in jail if they caught you spitting on the sidewalk or not wearing a mask. So when I heard all this, people talking about, oh, this is so socialist, that we got to wear these masks and social distance, I'm sitting there going, no, we've known how viruses work for a really long time. And this is how we stop from getting each other sick, is we just kind of stay away from each other for a while. And that works out pretty well. So I'd go to the gym and tell people all this stuff, and they're like, oh my God, you're Nostradamus. How'd you know all this stuff? I'm like, well, I actually just read a book, but okay. So we're geared up for season 2 on Diamond State Murder Board. And we've got, I'm working on a cold case, out of Lubbock, Texas, and it's heating up. It was featured on the Netflix series, The Confession Killer, with Henry Lee Lucas.
Yeah.
We've been in contact with a family. Actually, they approached us, and we've been in communication with them. I probably in the last 2 days have probably spent 10 hours on the phone with a family member, and we're putting the case together, my partner and I. What we do is we just scrap everything that's known about the case, and we just start fresh. Like we We've recreated the scenario of how this 18-year-old woman was murdered. And so it's a 40-year-old cold case. So we're just trying. I mean, we don't know. We told her we can't promise anything. But I've covered 3 or 4 cases where, guess what? Somebody got arrested, and they went years and years and years without being arrested. So it can happen.
Man, it sounds like that you were constantly busy all the time, got projects and stuff everywhere. But yeah, like I said, thank you for your time. This has been one of my favorite interviews by far. I feel like we could keep talking and, not even really have like an effort to do that. But so do you have anything that you want to plug? Where can people find your book? Obviously Amazon, probably.
Yes.
What are the books that you have out right now so that we can get those in the show notes?
My first book is Witches in West Memphis. And that's about the West Memphis Three. My second one is The Creekside Bones, which is an anthology style book about 4 or so cases that I covered through the years that are very heinous. The third one is called Whispers in the Willows. And it talks about a couple at that time. Rebecca wasn't solved. But I always tell people that book, even though it's been solved now, still, if you need like a fundamental foundation of the facts of the case and where it progressed to after Helen gone, that's a great book for that. Plus, I talk about the Amanda Tussing murder case, which is unsolved from here in Jonesboro from 21 years ago. Actually, it was featured on Still a Mystery, the TV show, Discovery Channel.
Yeah.
And in fact, I did an interview for that TV show right here in this room during COVID with an old crappy laptop that I had, which I thought there's no way this is going to work. And sure enough, one day I was watching Discovery Channel and boom, there it was. And there I was. I was like, wow. So Whispers in the Willows. And then obviously my new book is called A Novel Wait. And that's a play on words because we were all waiting and it was a new wait. And a novel is the word for new. So that, and then getting ready for that second season of our podcast. I think that's it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you said it so casually, like that's not a lot of things you got going on here. But like I said, George, thank you for sitting down. Thanks for kicking us off with our season 2 of the Clever Angle podcast. Like I said, we'll have all of the links to all where you can find his books and his podcast in the show notes. So yeah, this has been another episode of the Clever Angle podcast. Tune in next week and we'll have another amazing guest. Until next time, peace.